porcelain plate shattered at Miss Chen's feet, spraying sharp shards across her worn shoes. A low-level gangster named Executive O laughed, tossing a dirty dollar bill at her chest. He told the ghost girl to get on her knees and scrub the floor while the whole neighborhood watched and did nothing. For years, they had treated her like she was invisible, just a nameless face serving coffee to dangerous men who never even learned her name. The room went deathly silent when the heavy glass doors swung open. Mudok, the most feared mafia boss in the city, walked in with a cold, terrifying stare. His guards moved like shadows, locking the exits and gripping their weapons. The air turned to ice as the powerful man stopped right in front of the mess on the floor. Everyone expected the waitress to tremble or beg for her life as the king of the Underworld looked down at her. Instead, Miss Chen stood tall and looked the monster directly in the eye. She didn't flinch. She leaned in and whispered a secret that made the boss freeze. "The man who tried to kill you last night is sitting at table 4, she said, her voice like a sharp blade. She pointed to a tiny bloodstain on Mudok's expensive sleeve that no one else had noticed. In that 1 second, the ghost vanished, and the Underworld realized they had been ignoring the most dangerous woman in the room. The silence in the diner was so thick it felt like it could shatter. Every eye was locked on table 4. Before Miss Chen's whisper could even fade, Mudok's guards moved with the speed of striking cobras. 2 men in black suits vaulted over the counter, their heavy boots thundering against the floor. Before the traitor at table 4 could even pull the pistol from his waistband, he was pinned against the wall. His forehead hit the wood with a dull thud, and his weapon clattered uselessly onto the floor. Executive O, the man who had just been mocking Chen, turned pale. He scrambled backward, nearly tripping over his own feet. He had spent his whole life thinking he was a predator, but in the presence of Mudok, he looked like a panicked rabbit. The regulars at the diner held their breath. They were used to seeing violence, but they were not used to seeing it sparked by a woman they usually ignored. Mudok didn't look at the traitor. He didn't look at his guards. His dark, piercing eyes were fixed entirely on Miss Chen. It was as if the rest of the world had melted away. He noticed the way she stood, shoulders squared, chin tilted up, one hand resting firmly on her hip. She wasn't shaking. Her breath was steady and calm. For the first time in his life, Mudok was looking at someone who wasn't afraid of his shadow. He stepped closer, his expensive shoes crunching on the broken porcelain plates. He stopped only inches away from her. The air between them hummed with a strange, dangerous energy. To anyone else, she was just a waitress in a stained apron. To him, she was a map of his own secrets. "How long have you been watching me?" Mudok asked. His voice was a low growl, but it wasn't angry. It was curious. Chen didn't blink. "I don't just watch you, boss," she replied. "I watch everyone. People think I'm a ghost, so they talk as if I'm not there. They plan their murders over eggs and toast. They count their dirty money while I refill their coffee. You'd be surprised what a ghost can hear." Mudok reached out. The room gasped, expecting him to strike her for her boldness. Instead, his fingers brushed the white lace of her apron, right near the spot where the coffee had splashed. His hand was steady, but his mind was racing. He had spent millions on high-tech security and professional spies. Yet this woman had more information than all of them combined. She was a witness to a war he was barely winning. "Executive O," Mudok said, his voice ringing through the diner, without him even turning around. The thug jumped, his voice trembling. "Why, yes, boss." "You called her a ghost," Mudok said coldly. He finally turned his head, and his gaze was like a death sentence. "But she sees more than you ever will. You threw money at her to clean up a mess you made. Now, pick up every shard of that plate with your bare hands. If there's a single piece of dust left when I leave, you won't need your hands anymore." Executive O dropped to his knees instantly. He began grabbing the sharp ceramic pieces, his fingers bleeding, his pride vanishing with every second. The neighborhood watched in total shock. The man who had bullied them for years was now groveling at the feet of the woman he had tried to humiliate. Mudok turned back to Chen. He realized then that she was a liability he couldn't leave behind, but she was also a weapon he couldn't afford to lose. He reached out and placed a hand on her shoulder. It wasn't a gesture of comfort. It was a declaration of ownership. "The diner is closed," Mudok announced to the room. He looked at Chen with a faint, dangerous smile. "You're coming with me, Miss Chen. We have much to discuss, and I think you've served your last cup of coffee." The heavy glass door of the diner hissed shut, cutting off the sound of Executive O's frantic breathing as he scraped the floor. Outside, the street was lined with black sedans that looked like polished obsidian under the dim city lights. The neighborhood had gone quiet. People watched from behind half-closed curtains and cracked apartment windows. They were waiting to see the waitress dragged away. They expected a struggle. Instead, Mudok didn't grab her. He didn't use handcuffs. He simply stepped aside and gestured toward the largest car in the fleet, a long, bulletproof limousine with windows so dark they looked like mirrors. One of his guards, a man with a scarred neck and a sharp suit, stepped forward to open the heavy door. "Get in," Mudok said. It wasn't a request, but his tone lacked the cruelty he usually showed his enemies. He was watching her closely, waiting for the moment her massive calm would finally break. He wanted to see the flicker of terror that everyone eventually showed him. Miss Chen didn't hesitate. She didn't look back at the diner, where she had spent 3 years being ignored. She didn't look at the neighbors who had never bothered to learn her name. She smoothed out her white apron, held her head high, and stepped into the plush, leather interior of the car. She sat down as if she belonged there, her posture straight and her hands folded neatly in her lap. Mudok climbed in after her, the door closing with a heavy, metallic thud that sealed them away from the world. The interior of the car smelled of expensive sandalwood and old money. A glass partition separated them from the driver, creating a private, silent bubble. As the car pulled away from the curb, the neighborhood stood in stunned silence. They didn't see a victim being kidnapped. They saw a woman being escorted like a queen. The ghost of the neighborhood was leaving in the king's carriage, and for the first time in history, the people on that street felt small compared to her. Inside the car, Mudok poured a drink from a small silver decanter. The ice clinked against the glass, the only sound in the quiet cabin. He watched Miss Chen out of the corner of his eye. She was looking out the window, watching the familiar streets of her neighborhood disappear. "You realize you can never go back there," Mudok said, his voice low and steady. "You told me a secret that could start a war. In my world, a witness is either an ally or a body in the river. Do you understand which one you are right now?" Chen turned her head slowly. She didn't look at his drink or his expensive watch. She looked at the man himself. "I understood at the moment I opened my mouth, boss," she said. "I've lived in that neighborhood for years. I've seen men like you come and go. Most of them die because they think they are too big to be hurt by small people." Mudok leaned back, a small, dark smile touching his lips. He was used to people begging for their lives or offering him money. He wasn't used to being lectured by a waitress in a cheap uniform. "You have a lot of heart for someone who owns nothing," he remarked. "I own what I see," Chen replied. "And right now, I see a man who is bleeding through his shirt and has a traitor in his own house. You didn't take me because you're worried about a witness. You took me because you've realized I'm the only person in this city who actually sees the truth." Mudok set his glass down. The curiosity he felt earlier was turning into something much deeper. He had planned to take her to a safe house and interrogate her. Now, he realized that wouldn't be enough. He needed her eyes. He needed her mind. "You're right," Mudok admitted, his eyes narrowing. "I'm not taking you to the docks. I'm taking you to my home. From this moment on, you aren't a waitress, and you aren't a ghost. You're my guest. And in my house, the only thing more dangerous than the secrets you keep is the person who knows how to use them." The car sped up, leaving the neon lights of the slums behind and heading toward the high-rise towers of the elite. The forced promotion had begun. The limousine glided through massive iron gates that felt like the jaws of a giant. As they pulled up to the high-rise estate, the building loomed over them like a mountain made of glass and steel. It was beautiful, but it was cold. To the rest of the world, this was a palace of wealth. To Miss Chen, as she stepped out of the car, it felt like a fortress designed to keep the world out and its secrets in. Mudok led her through a lobby of white marble that shone like ice. He didn't speak a word as they ascended in a private elevator. When the doors opened, they were at the top of the city. He walked her down a long hallway lined with mirrors. Everywhere she looked, she saw her own reflection, a woman in a stained waitress uniform standing in a world of gold. "This is your space," Mudok said, opening a heavy mahogany door. The room was breathtaking. It had floor-to-ceiling windows, a bed draped in silk, and furniture that cost more than her entire neighborhood. But as Chen stepped inside, she heard the soft, electronic click of the lock engaging behind her. She walked to the window and looked down. The people below looked like ants. She wasn't just a guest. She was a bird in a very expensive cage. A moment later, the door opened again. A group of staff members entered, led by a woman with gray hair pulled back, so tight it looked painful. They didn't offer smiles or greetings. Instead, they dropped a pile of high-end clothes on the bed and stared at Chen with eyes full of fire. "You think because the boss brought you here you are special?" the older woman hissed. Her voice was full of a bitter poison. "You are just a stray he picked up from the gutter. Do not get comfortable. Ghosts like you usually disappear before the sun comes up." The other maids whispered and snickered, purposely bumping into Chen's shoulder as they walked past her. They treated her with a hot, sharp hostility that was meant to make her crumble. They wanted her to feel small. They wanted her to know she didn't belong in this world of polished stone and silent hallways. But Chen didn't flinch. She stood in the center of the room, her hand on her hip, watching them with the same calm, unreadable expression she used at the diner. She didn't argue. She didn't defend herself. Instead, she did what she did best. She observed. She noticed the way the head maid's hands trembled, a sign of deep fear. She saw the way the younger maid kept glancing nervously at the security camera in the corner. She noted the heavy ring on the lead woman's finger, which left a mark on her skin, suggesting she took it off often to hide something. As the staff marched out and the door locked once more, Chen sat on the edge of the silk bed. The neighborhood used to treat her like a ghost because they thought she was nothing. These people treated her like a ghost because they were afraid of what she represented. She realized then that the rules of the Mafia were exactly like the rules of the diner. Power was a game of shadows. If she wanted to survive this fortress of mirrors, she couldn't act like a victim. She had to remain a ghost, the kind that stayed silent, watched every move, and waited for the perfect moment to reveal the truth. She looked at her reflection in the glass. The waitress's uniform was still on, but the woman underneath was already beginning to change. She wasn't just waiting for Mudok to return. She was learning how to run the house before she even knew where the kitchen was. The silence of the night was broken by a heavy, uneven thud in the hallway. Miss Chen was awake instantly. She didn't panic. She moved to the door and pressed her ear against the wood. She heard a choked gasp and the sound of someone sliding down the wall. When she pounded on the door, it didn't open. She waited, counting the seconds, until the electronic lock finally hummed and clicked. Mudok stumbled into the room, his face the color of gray ash. He was clutching his side, and dark blood was already soaking through his white silk shirt. He collapsed onto the edge of the bed, his breathing coming in jagged, painful bursts. "I'll call your guards," Chen said, reaching for the bedside phone. "No," Mudok barked, though the word ended in a cough. He grabbed her wrist with a trembling hand. "No doctors. No guards. If they see me like this, if they know the wound turned, I'm a dead man by morning. In this world, a sick king is just a target." Chen looked at him. She saw the sweat beading on his forehead and the glassy look in his eyes. He was burning up with fever. The secret he was hiding was literally killing him. Most people would have seen a terrifying boss. Chen saw a man who was about to die from pride. She stood up and stripped off the high-end silk robe she had been given, revealing her old, stained waitress uniform underneath. It was her armor. "Fine," she said, her voice steady and commanding. "But if I'm going to save you, you have to shut up and do exactly what I say." She didn't wait for an answer. She moved through the suite like a whirlwind. She gathered a bottle of strong whiskey from the minibar, a sewing kit from the dresser, and clean white towels from the bathroom. Back in Baltimore, she had lived through nights where the hospitals were too far and the streets were too hot. She had learned how to stitch a wound by candlelight while the sirens wailed outside. She knelt between his knees and began to cut away the expensive fabric of his shirt. When she saw the wound, she didn't flinch. It was angry red and swollen. It smelled of infection. "This is going to hurt," she warned. She poured the whiskey directly onto the wound. Mudok let out a low, guttural roar and gripped the bedsheets, so hard the fabric tore. He squeezed his eyes shut, his muscles jumping under his skin. Chen didn't hesitate. She used a sewing needle, sterilized by a lighter, and began to work. Her hands were like rock. She didn't tremble, even as Mudok's heavy breathing warmed the top of her head. She moved with a quiet, surgical grace that had nothing to do with being a waitress. She was focused, intense, and completely in control. As she pulled the final stitch tight, the room grew quiet again. Mudok opened his eyes. The fire of the fever was still there, but the panic had faded. He looked down at the woman, kneeling at his feet. She was covered in his blood, her apron ruined, but she looked more powerful than any general he had ever met. She wiped his brow with a cool, wet cloth. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The distance between the mafia boss and the ghost waitress had vanished. "Where did you learn to do that?" Mudok whispered, his voice weak but full of genuine wonder. "Where I come from, you don't wait for someone to save you," Chen replied, meeting his gaze. "You learn to save yourself. And if you're lucky, you learn how to save the people worth keeping around." Mudok reached out and touched her hand. It wasn't a grab or a command. It was the first time he truly saw her, not as a witness and not as a guest, but as a woman who held his life in her red-stained fingers. In that small, blood-scented room, he realized she didn't need a crown to be a queen. She already carried the power in her heart. 3 days later, the fever had broken, and Mudok was back on his feet. He dressed in a suit that looked like it was woven from midnight, but he moved with a slight stiffness that only Chen noticed. He didn't send a maid to her room this time. He came himself. He threw a small velvet box onto her bed. Inside was a simple, elegant black dress. "Put it on," he commanded. "We are going to dinner. You are no longer the woman who stitches wounds in the dark. Tonight, you are my guest." Chen looked at the dress, then back at him. "Why?" "I have a meeting with 3 of my captains," Mudok said, his eyes narrowing. "One of them is stealing from the shipments. My guards are good at shooting, but they are blind to the truth. You spent years watching people in that diner. You know what a man looks like when he's hiding a secret." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Don't speak. Don't eat. Just watch their eyes. Tell me who is lying." The restaurant was a private room tucked away in the back of a high-end skyscraper. The air was thick with the scent of expensive cigars and aged whiskey. 3 men sat at a heavy oak table. There was Captain Han, who laughed too loud, Captain Song, who kept checking his gold watch, and Captain Lim, who sat perfectly still. As Mudok sat at the head of the table, he gestured for Chen to sit in the chair right beside him. The captains froze. Their eyes darted to her, filled with confusion and hidden anger. They saw a black woman in a beautiful dress, sitting in a seat that usually belonged to the highest-ranking men in the organization. "Who is she?" Captain Han asked, his smile faltering. "She is my eyes," Mudok said simply. "Continue with the report." For 2 hours, the men talked about numbers, routes, and money. Chen didn't touch her water. She didn't move. She sat like a statue, her gaze drifting from one face to another. She wasn't listening to their words. She was listening to their bodies. She saw Captain Han's foot tapping rhythmically under the table. She saw Captain Song's fingers trembling slightly every time the word shipment was mentioned. But it was Captain Lim, the one who sat so still, who caught her attention. Every time Mudok asked a direct question about the missing money, Lim's left eyelid gave a tiny, almost invisible flicker. He wasn't nervous. He was focused on maintaining a lie. When the dinner ended and the men were dismissed, the room went cold and quiet. Mudok leaned back and lit a cigarette. He didn't look at her. "Well, Captain Han is a gambler, but he's too scared to steal from you," Chen said, her voice calm and sure. "Captain Song is worried about his own mistakes, but his hands are clean of this. And Lim?" Mudok asked. "Lim is your thief," Chen replied. "He sits still because he's practiced his face in the mirror. but he can't control his eyes. Every time you mention the docks, he stopped breathing for 2 seconds. He's not just stealing, boss. He's waiting for you to fail. Mudok finally turned to look at her. He had expected her to be overwhelmed by the power in the room. Instead, she had dissected his most dangerous men like she was reading a simple menu. He realized then that her invisibility hadn't just been a burden. It had been the greatest training ground in the world. He stood up and walked over to her. He didn't treat her like a servant. He offered her his hand to help her stand. "You've spent your life being a ghost," he said, his voice full of a new kind of respect. "But a ghost is the only thing that can walk through walls. You're more than a witness. Chen, you're a weapon." As they left the room, the guards outside bowed. For the first time, they didn't just bow to Mudok. They bowed to the woman walking beside him. Chen felt the shift in the air. The lesson in power was over. She wasn't just surviving the underworld anymore. She was starting to see exactly how to rule it. The following afternoon, the air in Mudok's private garden felt heavy, like the sky before a thunderstorm. A man with white hair and a face carved from stone sat across from Mudok. This was Chairman Park, a rival boss whose family had controlled the city's docks for 40 years. He was a man who lived by old rules and had no room for anyone he considered below him. Mudok sat back, his face a mask of calm, while Chen stood slightly behind him. She was wearing the black dress again, but she still carried herself with the quiet, watchful energy of the diner. Chairman Park didn't look at Mudok. Instead, he stared at Chen with a look of pure disgust. He acted as if she were a piece of furniture that had been painted the wrong color. To him, she wasn't a guest or a partner. She was a mistake. "I heard you were keeping a new pet, Mudok," Park said, his voice raspy and cruel. "But I didn't realize you were bringing help to our negotiations. It's bad for business. It makes you look weak." Mudok didn't offend her. He didn't even blink. He simply lit a cigar and watched Chen out of the corner of his eye. This was a test. In the Mafia, your status was only as strong as your ability to demand it. If Chen couldn't handle a bully like Park, she would never survive the council. Park snapped his fingers loudly, the sound echoing off the stone walls. He pointed to the iron teapot sitting on a low table between the two men. "Don't just stand there, girl. The sun is hot and I am thirsty. Pour my tea." The guards at the edge of the garden shifted uncomfortably. They knew how dangerous Park was, and they knew that refusing him was an insult to his entire bloodline. They expected Chen to bow her head, scurry forward, and play the part of the servant to keep the peace. Instead, Chen moved with a slow, deliberate grace. She didn't look frightened. She didn't look angry. She picked up the heavy iron pot. It was steaming, the water inside still at a rolling boil. She stepped toward Chairman Park until she was inches away from him. She began to pour. The tea at the bottom of the delicate porcelain cup with a sharp, splashing sound. Steam rose in thick clouds, obscuring Park's face. Chen didn't look at the cup. She kept her eyes locked directly on Park's. She poured until the water reached the very brim of the cup. Then she kept pouring. The scalding liquid began to rise into a perfect, trembling dome of water, held together only by surface tension. A single millimeter more, and the boiling tea was spilled onto Park's expensive silk trousers. The heat coming off the cup was intense. Park's hand, which was resting near the saucer, began to twitch. He could feel the steam burning his skin. He looked up, expecting to see a trembling girl. Instead, he saw a woman whose eyes were as cold and steady as a predator's. Chen didn't say a word. She just held the heavy pot perfectly still, her gaze never wavering. She was daring him to move. She was showing him that she had more control over her fear than he had over his pride. Finally, Park couldn't take the heat or the pressure of her stare. He jerked his hand away, his chair scraping loudly against the stone floor. He flinched, his face turning a deep, angry red. He had blinked first. Chen calmly set the teapot back on its stand. She hadn't spilled a single drop on the table. "Your tea is ready, Chairman," she said, her voice smooth and cold. "I hope it's hot enough for you." Mudok let out a short, sharp laugh. It was the first time Chen had heard him sound truly amused. He looked at Park, who was shaking with silent rage, and then at Chen. The respect in Mudok's eyes was now undeniable. "She isn't to help Park," Mudok said, leaning forward. "She's the only one in this garden who isn't afraid of getting burned. Maybe you should remember that before you snap your fingers again." The sun was setting, turning the city sky into a bruised purple as the convoy moved through the narrow streets on the edge of the old neighborhood. Mudok sat in the back of the lead car, his eyes closed, finally letting the exhaustion of the day show. He looked like a man who thought he was safe. Miss Chen, however, was not relaxed. She watched the shadows of the alleyways. She knew these streets. She knew which corners were too quiet and which streetlights were always broken. She felt a prickle of heat on the back of her neck. "Driver, don't take the bridge," she said suddenly. Her voice was sharp and clear. The driver glanced in the rearview mirror, his face full of doubt. "The bridge is the fastest way to the estate in Mississippi." "The bridge is a trap," Chen replied, her eyes narrowing as she spotted a dark van idling without its lights on. "Turn left. Now!" Before the driver could argue, the world exploded. A hail of bullets shattered the rear window of the car behind them. The screech of tires and the roar of engines filled the air. Mudok was awake instantly, his hand reaching for the weapon tucked into his waistband, but a second van swung out to block their path forward. "Go back!" Mudok shouted, but the driver was frozen, his knuckles white as he gripped the wheel. "The back way is blocked." Chen yelled over the gunfire. She lunged forward, grabbing the driver's shoulder. "Listen to me. If you go right, we're cornered. Go through the alley behind the fish market. It's too narrow for their vans, but this car can make it." The driver looked at Mudok, who saw the absolute certainty in Chen's eyes. "Do what she says." Mudok roared. The car swerved, the tires screaming as they banked into a gap between two brick buildings that looked impossibly small. Bullets sparked against the metal frame of the car as they dived into the darkness of the alley. Chen didn't scream. She didn't hide on the floor. She leaned forward, pointing at the maze of turns she had walked every night for 3 years. "Left at the dumpster. Now, right behind the laundry," she commanded. The heavy limousine scraped against the walls, sparks flying like fireworks. But Chen was right. The large vans chasing them couldn't fit. She heard the sound of a heavy crash behind them as the lead pursuer wedged itself into the narrow passage, blocking the rest of the hit squad. They burst out onto a main road 3 blocks away, the engine roaring as they found clear pavement. The sound of gunfire faded into the distance. The car was battered, and the windows were spider-webbed with cracks, but they were alive. The driver pulled over into a hidden parking garage a few miles away. He sat there, shaking, his breath coming in gasps. Mudok lowered his gun. He looked at Chen. A single strand of her hair had fallen out of place, but otherwise, she looked as calm as if she were still pouring tea. "You knew exactly where to go," Mudok said. His voice was thick with emotion she hadn't heard before. It wasn't just a surprise. It was awe. "I told you, boss," Chen said, finally letting out a long breath. "I've lived here a long time. I know every hole a rat can hide in." They thought they knew this neighborhood, but they don't know it like a ghost does. Mudok reached out. This time, he didn't put his hand on her shoulder to claim her. He took her hand in his and squeezed it. It was a gesture between equals. He had spent his whole life protecting his territory, but tonight, a woman from the gutter had protected him. "I brought you to my house to keep you safe," Mudok whispered, looking at their joined hands. "But I think you're the one keeping me alive." The dynamic in the car had changed. The boss and the waitress were gone. In their place were 2 survivors who had found a way to win in a world that wanted them both dead. The protection was over. The partnership had truly begun. Executive O sat in a dark room, the glow of 3 computer monitors reflecting off his sweaty forehead. His fingers bled from the cuts he had received while cleaning the diner floor, but he didn't care about the pain. He only cared about revenge. He couldn't understand how a nameless waitress had dismantled his life in a single night. He was convinced she was a spy, a plant, or something worse. He had spent 48 hours digging into the past of Miss Chen. And finally, the digital veil began to lift. He didn't find a simple waitress. He found a ghost. The records showed that Chen had arrived in Seoul 3 years ago from Baltimore, Maryland. On the surface, she looked like an immigrant looking for a fresh start. But as O dug deeper into restricted police files from across the ocean, he found a different story. He saw photos of a younger Chen standing in the middle of a street war that had claimed the lives of half her neighborhood. She hadn't just lived in a dangerous place. She had been the daughter of a man who ran the most feared security firm in the city. She had been trained to survive since she could walk. "You aren't a ghost," O whispered to the screen, a jagged smile spreading across his face. "You're a fugitive." The files revealed that Chen had disappeared after a massive betrayal in her home city. She had saved her younger brother from a rival gang and vanished before the police could question her. She wasn't hiding from the law. She was hiding from a debt of blood. O realized that Chen wasn't afraid of Mudok, because she had already looked at much worse monsters back home. But then he found the leverage he needed. In a small, quiet suburb outside of Baltimore, there was an elderly woman and a young boy living under a different name. Chen's mother and brother. They were the reason she worked long shifts at a greasy diner. They were the reason she sent half her paycheck across the world every month. They were her heart. And in Executive O's world, a heart was just a target. He leaned back, his eyes gleaming with a cruel light. He didn't need to kill Chen himself. He just needed to show Mudok that his queen was a woman with a past that could bring the FBI and international gangs to his doorstep. And if that didn't work, he would make sure Chen knew that one phone call to the wrong people in Baltimore would end her family's life. O picked up his phone and began to type an encrypted message. He was going to wait for the perfect moment to strike. He wanted Chen to feel like she was finally safe. He wanted her to believe she was truly a partner to the king. And then he would pull the rug out from under her feet and watch her fall. Back at the estate, Chen stood on the balcony, looking out at the city. She felt a strange shiver run down her spine. The air felt thin, like a storm was coming from thousands of miles away. She had spent years trying to bury the girl from Baltimore, but she knew better than anyone that secrets never stay buried. They just wait for someone hungry enough to dig them up. She touched the railing, her grip tightening until her knuckles turned white. She had saved Mudok twice, but she knew the hardest fight was yet to come. The neighborhood had treated her like a ghost, and she was starting to realize that the past was the only ghost she couldn't outrun. The night was still, but the air inside Mudok's study felt heavy with unspoken words. Mudok sat behind his massive desk, but he wasn't working. He was staring at the bandages on his arm, the ones Chen had applied with such steady hands after the drive-by shooting. He looked up as the door opened. Chen walked in, carrying a tray with tea. She had traded her waitress apron for a soft silk robe, but her eyes were still the eyes of a soldier. "You should be resting," Chen said quietly. She set the tray down, the clink of the porcelain the only sound in the room. "I can't sleep," Mudok replied. His voice was tired, stripped of its usual iron authority. "Every time I close my eyes, I see that alleyway. I see how close we came to the end." He looked at her, his dark eyes searching hers. "Why didn't you run? When the bullets started flying, you could have jumped out. You could have disappeared back into the shadows." Chen walked around the desk and stood beside his chair. She didn't look away. "I've spent my whole life running Mudok. From Baltimore to Seoul, I've been a ghost moving from one corner to the next. But when I looked at you in that car, I realized something. For the first time in 3 years, someone actually saw me. I'm not running from the only person who knows I exist." The honesty in her voice hit Mudok harder than any physical blow. He reached out, his fingers brushing against her hand. He pulled her closer, not as a boss commanding a servant, but as a man seeking heat in a cold world. Chen didn't pull away. She leaned into him, her hand resting against his cheek. "You aren't just a witness anymore, Chen," Mudok whispered. "You're the only thing that feels real in this house full of mirrors." He stood up slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. The distance between them vanished. When he leaned in, it wasn't a calculated move. It was a desperate need. Their lips met in a kiss that was both soft and hungry. It was a kiss that broke all the rules of the Underworld. In that moment, the Mafia boss and the black waitress were gone. There were only two souls finally finding a home. Chen felt a warm spread through her chest that she hadn't felt in years. For a few seconds, she forgot about the gangs in Baltimore. She forgot about the blood on the diner floor. She felt safe. She felt seen. But high up in the corner of the room, hidden behind a decorative vent, a tiny red light blinked. Miles away, in his dark basement, Executive O leaned toward his monitor. A cruel, jagged smile split his face as he watched the grainy footage of the embrace. He hit the record button, his eyes gleaming with malice. Beautiful, O whispered to the empty room. Enjoy your little dream, Miss Chen, because I'm about to turn it into a nightmare the whole world will see. He leaned back, watching the impossible kiss play over and over again. He had the proof he needed. He had the weapon that would destroy Mudok's reputation and put a target on Chen's back. The trap was set, and the queen didn't even know she was standing in the middle of it. The grand hall was filled with the smell of expensive tobacco and the heavy weight of judgment. 12 men, the most powerful mafia leaders in the country, sat around a table made of dark stone. In the center of the room, Miss Chen stood alone. She felt their eyes crawling over her like insects. Behind her, on a massive screen, the image of her kiss with Mudok was frozen for everyone to see. Executive O stood at the head of the table, his face twisted in a triumphant sneer. He had just finished explaining Chen's past in Baltimore. He called her a fugitive, a common waitress, and a distraction that had made Mudok weak. She is a ghost from the gutter, Executive O shouted, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. She has bewitched our boss. She is a danger to our traditions and our bloodlines. I move that she be removed from this house, permanently. The council members began to whisper. Their voices were low and sharp, filled with mockery. They laughed at the idea of a waitress standing in their sacred hall. One man spat on the floor near Chen's feet. They expected her to cry. They expected her to beg. But Chen kept her chin lifted, her eyes fixed on the empty chair at the head of the table. Then, the heavy double doors swung open. Mudok walked in. He didn't look like a man who had been shamed. He walked with the slow, terrifying confidence of a king who had already decided who would live and who would die. He didn't look at the screen. He didn't look at the council. He walked straight to Chen and stopped beside her. The room went dead silent. Executive O's smile began to fade. Boss, O stammered, we were just discussing security risks this woman. Mudok didn't let him finish. He reached out and placed his hand firmly on Chen's shoulder. It was a heavy, declarative weight. He looked around the table, his eyes turning into shards of ice as he met the gaze of every man there. You speak of her as if she is a mistake, Mudok said. His voice was quiet, but it carried more power than O's shouting. You treat her like she is nothing, because you are too blind to see what is right in front of you. You saw a waitress. I saw a woman who saved my life while you were all hiding in your mansions. He squeezed Chen's shoulder, pulling her slightly closer. You call her a ghost. You say she has no place here. But she is the only one in this room who hasn't lied to me. She is the only one who saw the traitor at my table when none of you did. Mudok leaned forward, his face inches from Executive O's trembling nose. You treated her like nothing, Mudok announced, his voice booming through the hall. But today, I name her everything. From this moment on, Miss Chen is not a guest. She is my partner. She speaks with my voice. If you insult her, you insult me. If you move against her, you move against the throne. The council members gasped. This was more than defense. It was a coronation. Mudok wasn't just keeping her. He was giving her half of his empire. Chen felt a surge of heat in her chest. For years, the world had tried to erase her. They had tried to make her small. But standing there, with Mudok's hand on her shoulder, she realized the ghost was finally gone. She looked at Executive O, whose face had turned the color of ash. Mudok turned to her, a ghost of a smile on his lips. The floor is yours, Queen, he whispered. Chen stepped forward, her eyes scanning the men who had just been mocking her. They all looked down. They couldn't meet her gaze. The power in the room had shifted, and the black waitress was gone forever. The silence following Mudok's declaration was so heavy it felt like it might crush Executive O. He stood frozen, his eyes darting toward the exits, but Mudok's guards had already closed the doors. Chen stepped forward, the heels of her shoes clicking against the stone floor. She didn't look like a waitress anymore. She looked like a judge. "You spent so much time digging into my past." "Oh," Chen said, her voice steady and clear. "But you were so busy looking at screens that you forgot I was watching you. You thought I was just a girl from the gutter, so you didn't think twice about the things you did when I was in a room." Executive O tried to laugh, but it came out as a weak, strangled sound. "You have nothing but a kiss in a fairy tale, waitress. I am a loyal captain. I have served this family for 10 years. 10 years of service, and 1 year of selling us out," Chen countered. She turned to the council, her gaze sharp. "In the diner, O used to sit at table 6 every Tuesday. He thought I was a ghost, so he didn't care that I saw him switching his phone SIM cards every time a specific black car drove past. He thought I was just cleaning when I saw him take photos of the shipping manifest Mudok left on the seat of his car." O's face turned a sickly shade of green. "That's a lie. You have no proof." "I don't need a camera to see a thief," Chen said, stepping closer to him. "Yesterday, when we were attacked in the alley, the gunman knew exactly which turn we would take. There are only 2 people who knew that route, the driver and the man who programmed the GPS. The driver is dead, and you, have a fresh burn mark on your right thumb." The council members leaned in, their eyes moving to O's hand. He instinctively tried to hide it in his pocket, but it was too late. "That burn didn't come from the diner floor," Chen continued, her voice dropping to a cold whisper. "It came from a burner phone. The kind that gets too hot when you're frantically deleting messages while a hit squad is failing to do their job. You were so worried about the ghost that you didn't realize you were leaving a trail of blood and ash behind you." Mudok reached out and grabbed O's wrist, yanking his hand into the light. The angry, red blister on his thumb was unmistakable. Mudok didn't say a word, but the look in his eyes was more terrifying than a scream. He pulled O's personal phone from a man's pocket and tossed it to his head of security. "Check the signal pings from yesterday at sunset," Mudok commanded. "See if our loyal captain was talking to Chairman Park while we were being shot at." Minutes passed in agonizing silence. The security chief looked up from a tablet, his face grim. "The boss is right. He sent an encrypted location blast 10 minutes before the ambush." The recipient was Park's private line. The room erupted in a low, dangerous growl from the other captains. Executive O fell to his knees, his forehead hitting the floor. He wasn't laughing anymore. He was sobbing, begging for a mercy he had never shown anyone else. Chen stood over him, her shadow falling across his trembling back. She looked at Mudok, who was watching her with a pride that burned brighter than any sun. She had used the very thing they mocked, her invisibility, to dismantle the man who tried to destroy her. "You call me a ghost," Chen said to the man on the floor. "And you were right. A ghost sees everything. But unlike you, a ghost doesn't leave a trace." Mudok nodded to his guards. As they dragged the screaming traitor out of the hall, the rest of the council stood up. One by one, they bowed. They weren't bowing to Mudok's shadow anymore. They were bowing to the woman who had saved their empire with nothing but her eyes and her mind. The trial was over. The queen had won. Exactly 1 year had passed since the night the porcelain plate shattered, and the neighborhood had never been the same. The old, greasy diner was gone. In its place stood a building of polished stone and wide glass windows. It was a community center now, a place where people felt safe, but everyone knew it was also the heart of a new empire. The morning sun hit the pavement as a black sedan pulled up to the curb. The door opened and Miss Chen stepped out. She wasn't wearing a stained apron or a modest dress anymore. She wore a tailored power suit the color of midnight. Her hair was pulled back sharply, and her eyes were calm and steady. She didn't have to look for danger anymore. She owned the streets where it used to hide. As she began to walk down the sidewalk, a strange thing happened. The neighborhood, which used to treat her like a phantom, suddenly came alive with respect. A group of young men standing on the corner, the kind who used to catcall her or blow smoke in her face. When silent the moment they saw her, they didn't just stop talking. They scrambled to step off the sidewalk, clearing a wide path for her to pass. "Good morning, Miss Chen," one of them whispered, bowing his head so low he was looking at his shoes. Chen didn't stop, but she gave a small, regal nod. She walked past the grocery store, where the owner used to overcharge her. Today, the man ran outside just to sweep the entrance as she walked by, making sure not a speck of dust touched her heels. She was no longer the girl they could cheat or ignore. She was the law. She reached the front of the new center and found Mudok waiting by the doors. He looked healthy and strong, his tailored suit matching hers perfectly. He wasn't standing in front of her like a shield anymore. He was standing beside her. He held out a hand, and as she took it, the neighborhood watched the two of them, the kingmaker and his queen. "They're all watching you," Mudok said, his voice full of pride. "Let them watch," Chen replied, looking out at the streets she once haunted. "For 3 years, I saw everything they did while they pretended I didn't exist. Now, they have to see me every single day. They have to remember that the ghost they ignored is the one who keeps their world turning." Inside the center, the walls were lined with photos of the neighborhood and its people. It was a legitimate business, a place of peace, but the power behind it was absolute. Chen sat at her desk, a large oak table that overlooked the main square. She looked at a small, framed photo of her mother and brother in Baltimore. They were safe now. They were living in a house with a garden, protected by a security firm that reported only to her. She picked up a pen and began to sign the documents for the day. She had come to this city with nothing but a secret and a survival instinct. She had been slapped, hunted, and mocked, but she had kept her eyes open. She had turned her invisibility into a throne. As the sun rose higher, the queen of the Underworld looked out at her kingdom. The people below were no longer ghosts to her, and she was certainly no longer a ghost to them. She was a woman who had survived the shadows to rule the light. The waitress was gone, and in her place sat a woman who would never be ignored again.